We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Donna and Cecilia for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this season, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. A few of our upcoming programs include a journey with composer John Luther Adams on his experience making music in the frozen woods of Alaska. That is tomorrow. A presentation by mathematics professor Jason Rosenhaus considering the role of logic puzzles in recreation, math, and philosophy. And a conversation with Ruth Ben-Giet with Virginia Heffernan on how to stop authoritarian strongmen. Other programs include Mario Livio, Michael Eric Dyson in conversation with Robin DiAngelo, and our yearly Rogues Christmas event. There's much more to come this season, so check out our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall has been put under significant strain due to the ever-changing landscape. We hope you'll consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation, by clicking on the link to donate on your screen, or by becoming a member. Our partner booksellers have also been hit by the negative effects of COVID and can use your support as well. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the books being presented this evening, please use the link on this live stream page to go through Third Place Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for re-watching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about an hour long, including Q&A. We will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen here on Crowdcast, so feel free to submit those at any time. We'll also take questions from the YouTube chat if you're watching there. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arts and Culture series is supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank the members watching tonight as well. Donna Miscolta is an author who has published 3 books. Her story collection, Hola and Goodbye, Una Familia in Stories, was published in 2016, and her first book, When the De La Cruz Family Danced, was published in 2011. Recent essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Review and the anthology Alone Together, Love, Grief, and Comfort in the Time of COVID-19, which was featured in a town hall event just last month. She received a bachelor's degree in zoology from San Diego State and later received master's degrees in education and public administration from the University of Washington. She has since worked as a project manager in local government. You can find out more about her work at donnamiscolta.com. Cecilia Aragon is also an author and also an aerobatic pilot, and the first Latina full professor in the College of Engineering at the University of Washington. She received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from President Obama, and Hispanic Business Magazine named her one of the top 25 of 2009. Cecilia is a co-founder of Latinas in Computing and is a passionate advocate for girls and women in STEM. You can learn more about that at ceciliaaragonauthor.com. The themes addressed in Miscolta's book, Living Color, Angie Rubio Stories, and Aragon's book, Flying Free, My Victory Over Fear to Become the First Latina Pilot on the U.S. Aerobatic Team, are the subjects of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Donna Miscolta and Cecilia Aragon.
Thank you so much, Candace.
Thank you, Candace. And thank you, Town Hall.
Thank you. I know I, for one, am really excited to be here with Donna and with all of you. Thanks so much for spending this evening with us. So I guess Donna and I are going to give a one-sentence description of each of our books, and then we'll launch into a conversation, because we found, I know I was so excited when I got a copy of Donna's book and read it, that I could not wait for this evening to have this conversation with Donna. It's just amazing, the commonalities and the differences and the themes that come up from both of our books.
Yeah, there are a lot of commonalities, and the big difference I see is that I've never flown a plane. So, but
you could do
it. So I'll just give a brief summary of what this book is about. Living Color, Angie Rubio stories. It's a collection of stories that follows the character Angie Rubio through each grade in school as she learns life lessons about being a brown girl in a society that favors neither her color nor her gender. And Flying Free.
And my book, Flying Free, you can see it here, is the story of how a timid daughter of immigrants with terrible phobias overcame her fears to become a pilot, and not just an ordinary pilot, but the first Latina pilot on the United States aerobatic team, flying loops and rolls and spins and representing the United States at the Olympics of Aviation, the World Aerobatic Championships.
So the way this conversation is going to go, excuse me, the way the conversation is going to go, we're each going to introduce a topic that we think is we have in common with these books, and then we'll each add something about that topic. And so Cecilia is going to start us off.
All right, thanks, Donna. So yeah, Donna, we're both of mixed Filipina and Latina heritage. I mean, very unusual, I think. I grew up in the Midwest, where I was the only one of my kind. You grew up in Southern California, just south of San Diego. I'd like to talk a little bit about how place affected a sense of cultural and ethnic identity.
Yeah. So actually, this combination of, I'm Mexican and Filipino, and that combination is actually fairly common.
Okay, I didn't know.
Well, you're a different combination of.
In Indiana, there weren't any Mexican Filipinos either.
No, right. But where I grew up, it was not uncommon. And in our neighborhood, there were mostly Filipino families. And so most of my friends growing up were Filipino. And my father, though, resisted speaking Tagalog in the house, and he hardly ever spoke it with the neighbors. He was very reluctant to do so. What I heard more was Spanish, because my Mexican grandmother did not speak English. So my mother and my aunts all spoke Spanish with her. But none of us children grew up speaking Spanish, because the whole idea in our household was that we were Americans, that we were going to be Americanized, which I guess meant being monolingual, just speaking English, among other things. So I didn't have the same connection to a cultural or ethnic identity that my friends had. As a result, I never felt like I fully fit into one or the other group, until I actually realized that it was up to me, that even though my story was different from my friends, that I could still claim without qualifier and without apology both of these identities. And so my fiction reflects that. My first book, When the Dela Cruz Family Danced, was about a Filipino-American family. Living Color and Olin Goodbye featured Mexican-American characters. I think I have yet to figure out how to portray in fiction a character of mixed heritage, because I have the sense that non-white, when it comes to non-white characters, people want to have sort of an unambiguous identity for that character. And even though, I mean, it's not something I adhere to, I think that after a lifetime of hearing, where are you from and what are you? I sort of wanted to stay away from all those explanations that go along with having a character that's not easily definable. So, I mean, that's something I think I'd like to do in future work, but I think up to this point, I've avoided that. So.
Wow, that's really interesting. More things to talk about, Donna. So yeah, I mean, so I did not grow up in a community. There were no Latinos, well, there was one Filipino family that moved in later on in my small town in Indiana, but I did not feel like I belonged anywhere. So as a matter of fact, well, I'm going to talk just a little bit more, and then I'll give a reading that explains sort of how teachers perceived me. But the whole aspect of being, I mean, I wanted to belong to an ethnic group. I really wanted to have it. I'm just going to go and start with a reading because there's too many ideas popping up. Thank you for that wonderful answer, Donna. So this is from my memoir. I'm 7 years old and sitting in my second grade classroom, surrounded by dark green linoleum and black and white alphabet wall cards. On my desk in front of me sits the census form we've all been asked to fill out. My teacher, Mrs. Van Horn, looms over me. Mark your race as black, she instructs me. I stare at my own skin in bewilderment. Then I timidly raise my hand. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm black. And she says, well, you sure as heck aren't white. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in a small town in Indiana where most everybody else knew each other's grandparents, but both my parents were immigrants who spoke with thick accents. Who are you if you have a Chilean father and a Filipina mother? I didn't even belong to a recognized minority group, but I so wanted to. I desperately wanted an identity group, any identity group. I wanted to belong somewhere. But moments like filling out that census form were a constant part of my upbringing. And every time it happened, I felt confused, upset, and diminished. But despite all that confusion, I found solace in something that always made sense to me: math. While my English teacher accused me of plagiarism because someone like me couldn't possibly know all those advanced vocabulary words, in math, if I got the answers right, none of my teachers could mark me down. And it helped a lot that I always had my dad's support. When I did well in math, he'd tap my head and say with a huge grin, "This brain works." Whenever I brought home one of those big red 100s, he'd beam at me proudly and say, "My buttons are popping." I'd sit beside him at his big wooden desk by the window while he taught me math, writing equations one by one in his precise handwriting, and I loved it. But sadly, even when you have one voice telling you you're wonderful, that single voice can be drowned out by the chorus of teachers and classmates telling you you're nothing. Math was beautiful and it was fun, but it couldn't stop my classmates from bullying me. I'd started wearing long-sleeved shirts, hoping my parents wouldn't notice the bruises on my arms from the bullying. In school, I tried my best to not stick out, for fear of my tormentors, who might be waiting behind the cafeteria to punch me and call me a dirty spick. This caused me to avoid all eye contact. I shuffled along staring at the ground, and I went days in school without speaking. I became convinced there was something wrong with me, Why else would my classmates bully me and my teachers mentor the second best student instead of me? It must be that I was simply unlikable, a bad person. It never occurred to me it might be racism, since I wasn't even sure what race I belonged to. Instead, I concluded I had no talent in anything, and I became scared to try anything new. Hello, imposter syndrome. And that's what my life became. By the time I was 25 years old, I was scared of elevators. I was scared of climbing a ladder, shaking hands with a stranger, or even talking on the telephone. It seemed that whenever I had to do anything, my brain circuits jammed and I froze. I was terrified that people would find out the truth. I was a failure with a capital F. Then one day, a friend offered me a ride in a small plane.
Yes, this is a fantastic book, and it has some really wonderful things in it. And so I think this, you're reading that section, I think brings us to our next topic that we're going to talk about, which is microaggressions. And so while my book is a fictional account of the microaggressions that a young Mexican-American girl experiences as she progresses through school, you also recount many instances of microaggressions in your life. And so this is where our books intersect. But your experience went beyond microaggressions. You, as you indicated in your reading, you had to cover up bruises that came from physical attacks. But and you were also assaulted by a group of boys on the playground. And so I want to talk about how these experiences in my fictional character and your real life experiences were similar and where they diverge. So why don't you explain more about what happened?
Okay. Yeah. So, well, one of the things that I especially loved about Angie is that when she experienced microaggressions, and she was really feisty, she kind of fought back. She, it's kind of astonishing how, I mean, there was even a scene where oddly enough, it was common in both of our books where both of our characters were in this play put on by other kids. And in both cases, we were relegated to the lowest, not quite the villain, but maybe it was the villain for Angie, but not a very favorable character, right? The monster. In my case, it was the drug addict who died in the middle of the play. And for me, when I heard about Angie, fought back again about it. But when I was offered this terrible role in this play, I just said yes, because I was scared. I was so scared by then that I accepted kind of this role, and I internalized a lot of the microaggressions and overt aggressions, and said it must be that there's something wrong with me, because I didn't identify as part of a racial group, so there was nobody really to say we are being oppressed as a group. And it's actually a big deal to have commonality with others, solidarity and a group to be together with. When you're the only one, it's really hard to know what's real, and I didn't really, the only thing I got feisty about was math, because with math, the answer was, it was either right or wrong. So I knew it. It wasn't that I did, whatever the teacher said to me, I could cling to math and it would be my safety blanket, because I knew the answer was correct, no matter what they said. With my writing, I love to write. I'd been writing stories since I was 4 years old, but my teachers didn't like my writing. I didn't, so I assumed, oh, I'm just a terrible writer. But with math, hey, I was better at math than some of the teachers. So you know what? It was like magic. It was kind of a magic trick. And that's what I had. And that was wonderful. And, but Angie seemed to have an inner resilience that that was just wonderful to see. I loved reading her.
Well, so I think it just, excuse me, I think it emphasizes for me how difficult of an experience you had, because for me, Angie, she wasn't feisty right away. It was something that she had to develop over the course of time as she got older and as she got more, a little more confident, but also because this accumulation of microaggressions, at a certain point, you have to act. And I think early on, she was a reactor, and she was also an accommodator, because when her playmate said, I'll be the princess, and you'll be, this other girl will be the handsome prince, and you, Angie, will be the monster. Angie played the monster because otherwise she wouldn't get to play. So there are things like that where she just accepted the role, even though she didn't like it. But I think as she gets older, she does respond in a more active way. But again, as you were a child and experiencing sort of a powerlessness, Angie also experiences that powerlessness because, you know, she's a child. So it's the adults around her who have the power. It's the institutions that have the power and the control. It's the stereotypes even that have the power over, excuse me, I have a dry throat, over children and children of color who are subjected to these sort of stereotypes. And while math saved you, Angie didn't have a particular apparent talent. It wasn't until she got to high school that she started to recognize that the thing that had sort of saved her in a way was this sort of unrecognized ability that, at least unrecognized by her, that the thing she was able to do was express herself on paper with words, which is something you discovered for yourself as well. So, and in terms of, you know, when you talked about those experiences with being physically bullied, that really broke my heart. And I thought about how, you know, Angie was not subjected to that. And I think when I was writing her, I think I wanted to sort of protect her from that. But I also wanted to show that microaggressions on their own, even without physical violence, can do harm, that they're damaging to a person's psyche, and that they can result in wasting talent. I mean, when your teachers intentionally ignored your ability to write, you know, you felt something, you doubted yourself. So yes, microaggressions
are damaging to children.
Yes, they can thwart lives. They can waste human potential.
I think that I just want to address this before we go on to the next topic. I think that is so important. Thank you for bringing that up, Donna, because since my parents were immigrants and they experienced racism in the Midwest as well as I did, but it somehow they didn't internalize it. It didn't bother them as much as it did me as a child. And I think there's something to be said for growing up in a culture where you are perceived as inferior, where, you know, and that is true for women in this country. It's true for people of color in this country. And the worst part is when it happens to children. So this is why I'm so happy to see books like Donna's that give an account of, you know, what it's like growing up Latina in this country. And I would love to see more. My book is actually mostly about, you know, my flying adventure story and about how I kind of overcame obstacles to you know, to make it, and how I eventually found my community in the community of pilots of all places. But yeah, so I'd like to also talk about teachers. So both Angie and I had good and bad teachers who played large roles in both of our books, and they had an impact on both of our lives. In my case, the good and bad teachers that I described mostly had to do with flying, and they either helped me overcome challenges and learning how to fly as a very fearful person, or kind of hindered me because of their stereotypical beliefs about women pilots. So it did seem that Angie's teachers, intentionally or not, set her on a path to resistance and questioning, and sometimes to a small act of rebellion.
Yeah, well, because these stories follow Angie through each grade in school, teachers, of course, play a pretty visible role. And some of them are dismissive of her, and some of them are just outright cruel, like her kindergarten teacher, who humiliates her publicly because Angie does not know how to skip properly, which is apparently a developmental requirement for kindergarten. But there are other positive influences with other teachers, though at times they're a little clueless about who Angie is, who she really is, and what she really needs, because I think that they're not really seeing her as an individual. So teachers do play a role in Angie Rubio's life, and just as they did in my life, because in the acknowledgements page of my book, I mentioned some teachers that I had while I was growing up, and most of them were language arts or English teachers, except for my fourth grade teacher who taught all subjects. And this was where my strength was, even though I refused to see it at the time, or I was unable to see it. Maybe it was that I hadn't learned to value it. At any rate, I think it was the thing that kept me going, that helped me believe that I was capable of doing something. And this is something that I also transferred to Angie in her development as a character. And so when I was reading Cecilia's book, I was really paying attention to those early teachers that she had and the things that they said and did or didn't do for her when she was going through school. And also because there are certain times, Cecilia, when you were describing something that you were learning as you were learning how to fly or learning how to do aerobatics, that you would hearken back to a certain teacher that you had in grade school or high school, and think about what you learned from that experience. Whether it was a bad experience or whether it's a good experience, you learned something about how that teacher viewed you. And I think there was one in particular experience where you were in Germany. Everything was taught in German. And you had a couple of teachers, one who completely, gave up on you, and another who actually expected something of you. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, great. Yeah, so I can't see myself on the screen anymore, so I don't know whether I did something wrong. And but I'm going to just answer the question and keep going. So yeah, so when I was a sophomore in high school, I spent a year as a German language learner in Germany, and I knew very little German. And, in some ways, this has given me empathy for people who don't speak English here in the United States. I remember that in 10th grade in Germany, everybody had to take fourth year French. Now, I had never had any French, and this was French taught in German, and I didn't know German either. One of the other teachers, a German literature teacher, had said, "Oh, well, you, Cecilia, will never understand German literature because you don't speak our language, and therefore just sit in the back of the room and don't disturb the class." But this French teacher said, I want you to do all the tests and all the homework because I think you can learn this. And I was like, ah! And at first I preferred the German teacher to the French teacher because obviously it was easier to sit in the back and do nothing than it was to work and humiliate myself by showing that I really didn't know any French or any German. But this teacher was so encouraging. She found me a volunteer tutor. She graded all my assignments. And I still remember to this day, right around the semester break, she handed back my test, and it was a translation from German to French. And for the first time, I had passed the test with the equivalent of about a D-. And she said, "Congratulations," as she threw that D- on my desk. And you know what? I felt so proud of myself. And at the end of the year, so in the German class, I failed. In the French class, I actually was one of the top 3 students in the class. So this was a perfect test of what happens when you have the same kid, but one teacher believes in that kid and really pushes them and has high expectations, and another one has low expectations. I mean, they were both, I think, good. I think the German teacher was a good teacher for the German students, but he just had really low expectations about me. And guess what? I hit them.
Right. I'm curious too why I don't see you on the screen either.
You don't see me either?
No.
Yeah, is there a way to get me back on the screen? Okay. All right, that's odd. Let me see what happens. I'm going to try to refresh
Okay.
the page.
So in the meantime, while Cecilia is refreshing the page and getting back on the screen, I think that sort of leads us to another topic of discussion, which is being in control, taking control and being in command. Something that Cecilia had to teach while she was in the air, because she was a flight instructor. And as a lot of us, and I think women especially, struggle with, we've been taught to take orders. We've been taught to be obedient, not to be selfish, and not to call attention to ourselves, which would happen if we took control of a situation. So that's something I want us to talk about as soon as Cecilia gets back. But in terms of, and I'm going to talk about Angie then, in terms of taking control or being in control, because in terms of control, Angie doesn't have a whole lot. Her world is controlled by grownups. And I think I mentioned this earlier. Grownups, institutions, stereotypes, but she does respond. She tries to push back to the situations that she finds herself in that seem unfair to her. She doesn't always have the insight or understanding or the language to describe what's happening. And her actions always seem to fall short because she doesn't even know what to do. Yet she persists. And one interviewer called Angie brave and resilient. And I often thought of Angie as being baffled about the world and how people behave in it. And I think her actions were often driven by desperation rather than bravery. But then again, desperation often sort of motivates someone to be brave. And I think I mentioned earlier that the younger Angie is more of a reactor and an accommodator. Even though she knows something might be wrong, she hopes the situation will right itself. In fact, she hopes that someone will step in and right it for her. I think she realizes that she doesn't have a lot of agency. But at a certain point in her development, as she advances from grade to grade, as she gets older, her little acts of rebellion become more intentional and more tactical. And so I I attribute this to her growth, but also to her resilience. And resilience is something that I think Cecilia mentioned earlier. And I think that resilience is something that's alive in us all. The desire to survive and the desire to go beyond the situation. There's a I'll show them kind of attitude that we often promise to ourselves. And it's because one way of getting back is getting the better of a situation. So if not at that moment, that sometime in the future, because there's always the possibility that the future promises that something will happen later in a different time, in a different place, where we'll be able to handle the situation in a manner that's more suitable to us and more effective. So I think I'm going to read a little bit that sort of demonstrates that. Well, we're getting Cecilia back. So when Angie's in high school, she decides to write these articles, these op-ed pieces that she calls provocative pieces, because they tend to go against the normal, the popularly held opinions. But she pays a consequence for that. And so I'm going to read a little bit about the kinds of consequences that she experiences as a result of writing these provocative pieces. Whereas before, Angie had been a more or less anonymous outcast, she was now a notorious one, and she did not regret it much. She met the looks of disdain with indifference. She ignored the remarks and asides in the hallways. Wow, somebody's jealous, commie, women's liber. When she got home, she cried in a room. It was a different kind of crying, a different kind of aloneness than she'd felt before. This was an aloneness she had created, a deliberate aloneness, one that felt right. Or was it righteous? She wasn't quite sure what exactly the word was. When Letty complained to their mother that Angie was ruining her social life, Angie stood her ground. Why are you behaving like this? Her mother asked. Do you want kids at school to dislike you? Angie excavated a line from her childhood, which sometimes seemed very far in the past, and other times seemed as if it were a minute ago. Popularity isn't everything. She wondered if her mother remembered having said that. Words of wisdom that perhaps were not so much about wisdom, but about resignation and acceptance. Wanda and her gang tried to support her. They even agreed with her on the points that she made about popularity. But they couldn't reconcile their love of spectacle with Angie's derision of the homecoming queen and princesses and their escorts and scepters and crowns, all on display in convertibles that circled the football field. But Wanda, Angie reasoned, remember how you felt about Miss America, how you thought the whole pageant was stupid? Remember? Wanda thought a moment. Not exactly the same thing, she said. How not exactly? Wanda shrugged. Just not. Besides, it's fun, Angie. Lighten up. We're only young once. Then Angie and the others headed to the art room to make spirit banners. At lunchtime, rather than hide her friendless self in the library, she sat by herself on the senior lawn, putting herself on display, a book open in front of her, a few lines of which she managed to read when she wasn't intent on whispering to herself. Be bold. Be heard. Be provocative. All the years behind her of her so-called education had just been the simmer before the boil, the taxing before takeoff, the warm-up before the performance. Known all through her school life as a skinny, shy, small-voiced girl who was not very interesting. In her senior year of high school, Angie decided she would become a skinny, bold, provocative, loud enough to be heard girl. And then, it was a stutter Angie could not get past, which is why she seldom said the word out loud. College. She wanted to go, far away on the East Coast. She remembered Bernadette's college. She wanted that one. Wellesley, a women's college. She'd sent away for a brochure. It had photos of graceful brick and stone buildings amid woods and a lake. Young women bound for glory contemplatively strolled the grounds, studied in the vaulted ceiling library, bonded with one another in the commons. She kept the brochure paper clipped to the inside of her school notebook, mooned over it as if it were a secret crush. Angie made an appointment with her school counselor, a small man with black-rimmed glasses, a fine film of dark blonde hair and crowded little teeth. She sat in the straight-backed wooden chair across from his desk, behind which he swiveled in a large chair, a fist propping his pessimistic chin. It's a long way to go for college, he told her. Of course, that was the point.
There
to
I
get
am.
away as far as she could, from this school, from this city, from this life.
All right. Fingers crossed.
Okay, I was reading, and I'm going to stop there. I was just going through this scene where Angie goes to her high school counselor to ask for help about how to get to college, and he has no help whatsoever. And she leaves thanking him without getting anything for what she had gone to request, having utterly failed at being provocative, because that had been her goal with these provocative pieces she had written, to be provocative, to be bold, to be heard. And she goes to her school counselor, and then she's just none of those things. And so as much as she wants to change, there are still obstacles that she has to overcome. And
I mean, that's what I loved, because it's so true. That was so true. You know, you want to be provocative, you want to ask questions, and then it still doesn't quite work. Yeah. Anyway, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me and see me? Speaking of, so yeah, our next topic. So first of all, thank you, Donna, for jumping into the breach. That was great. So one of the things, so I guess we're going to go on with the next question about being in control.
Oh, excuse me. After the reading, my throat is extra dry. But actually, I did that section.
Oh, okay. All right. So then I'm going to respond about how okay, so as a child, I was really taught to be obedient. And this was, part of this came from the cultural heritage. I mean, my mother was very strict with us, and she really wanted us to be good and obedient. And being obedient was part of being a good person. She also thought that being selfish was definitely not being a good person. And for her, selfish sometimes meant, you know, standing up for yourself. So you never were supposed to draw attention to yourself as a woman in particular. I mean, I still remember something she told me as a child. When you get married, she just assumed I would marry a man. And she said, it's going to require compromise. And for a good marriage, it's going to have to be 60-40 and not 50-50. And it's the woman who has to give the 60. All right. I mean, although I agree this is a laudable goal for two people to each want to give 60, but it bothered me so much that it was the woman who had to give the 60. And so I said, you know, even as a young child, I was like, no, I'm never going to get married if that's the case, because it's not fair for me to have to give 60. And she said, you're selfish. So, yeah.
Right. That math didn't add up for you, right?
No. I was really into fairness and, you know, divide by 2, that's 50% each.
Yeah, I had the same experience I had when I was 10 years old. I told myself I was never going to get married, because it just seemed like the world was not made for women to have the things that they should have, especially if they were going to get married. So, but we both end up with spouses.
Yeah, right. So I ended up married to a wonderful guy, actually. So yeah. All right. So moving on then. So
well, I'm just wondering if we have time to move on to our next two topics, because I want to check with to see if we should be taking questions now, Candace. I don't know if she's hearing us. Or maybe she'll step in when she thinks it's time. Oh, there she is.
Yeah, we have plenty of time. Yeah, so feel free to address the next topics
All
that you
right,
have.
so we have a couple more really cool topics then. All right, so moving on from selfishness, let's totally shed our humility and talk about fame. All right, I write in my book. All right, okay, I'm going to get embarrassed even thinking about this. But the desire for fame had been one of my guilty secrets for years. So even though I was really shy and never sought the limelight, I secretly wanted it. And I craved attention, more attention. But whenever I drew it to myself, it turned out I would get scolded by teachers or hit by other kids. And so I ended up, kind of not feeling that it was a good thing for me to ask for. And what I loved about Angie, one of the things I loved about Angie, is she often thinks to herself, wait until I'm famous, whenever she feels wronged or dismissed or ignored. So what do you think, Donna? Is fame a bad thing to strive for?
Well, I think in Angie's case, it was just sort of a way to get her past that situation. In those times that she felt dismissed or ignored, it was like, just wait and see, wait till I'm famous. And it's not that I think she necessarily believed she would be famous or that necessarily she wanted to be famous. It was just that she wanted people to see her and to see her as someone who was capable of doing things. So I think this sort of thinking helps her hold out for hope that she can overcome the obstacles